Welcome to this deep dive into one of the darkest and most unsettling tales in American history. Well, here it is. The coal dust never truly left the air in Blackstone Hollow, West Virginia. Father Michael Brennan had learned this truth in his 3 years serving St. Catherine's Church, a modest wooden structure perched on a hillside overlooking the mining town below. Every morning, he would wake in his sparse rectory room to find a thin layer of black residue coating the windowsill, a constant reminder that this place was built on extraction, on the dangerous labor of men who descended into the earth's darkness before dawn and emerged only as dusk settled over the Appalachian ridges. Father Brennan was 32 years old, though his congregation often remarked that he carried himself with the gravity of someone much older. His dark hair, already showing threads of premature gray at the temples, was always neatly combed. His face, angular and serious, rarely broke into a smile during his daily routines, though his sermons carried a warmth that drew the mining families to him. He had come to Blackstone Hollow from a seminary in Baltimore, chosen for this remote posting because the previous priest had died of black lung disease, a common fate for anyone who breathed this mountain air for too many years. The autumn of 1899 arrived with unusual intensity. The leaves turned brilliant shades of crimson and gold, and the mountain winds carried a sharp edge that warned of the harsh winter ahead. Father Brennan maintained his disciplined schedule: morning mass at 6, confession hours, visits to the sick and dying, evening prayers, and the constant administrative work that kept the small parish functioning. The mining company, which owned most of the land and houses in Blackstone Hollow, donated generously to the church, understanding that religion kept the workers docile and hopeful despite the brutal conditions underground. It was on a Thursday morning in late September when everything changed. Father Brennan was preparing the altar for morning mass when he heard the church door creak open. He turned to see a young woman entering, her silhouette backlit by the early morning sun streaming through the doorway. She moved with a quiet grace, her dark green dress simple but well-maintained, her chestnut hair pinned up beneath a modest hat. As she approached down the center aisle, Father Brennan felt something unfamiliar stir within him, a sensation he immediately recognized as dangerous and sought to suppress. Her name was Catherine Walsh, and she was 24 years old. She had recently arrived in Blackstone Hollow from Charleston, sent to live with her uncle's family after her parents had died in a typhoid outbreak that swept through the state capital the previous winter. Her uncle, Thomas Walsh, was a mine foreman, a position that granted him slightly better accommodations than the average miner but still kept him firmly within the working class. Catherine had come to the morning mass seeking solace in her grief and displacement, finding herself in a strange town where the rhythms of life revolved entirely around the coal mine's whistle. Father Brennan conducted the mass with his usual precision, but he found his concentration wavering. His eyes drifted toward where Catherine sat in the third pew, her head bowed in prayer, her hands clasped with an intensity that spoke of genuine faith. After the service, she approached him to introduce herself, her voice soft but clear. She explained her situation, her recent losses, and her hope that the church community might provide some comfort in this difficult transition. Father Brennan listened with professional concern, offering words of consolation that he had spoken countless times before, yet feeling each word carry unexpected weight. In the weeks that followed, Catherine became a regular presence at St. Catherine's. She volunteered to help with the church's charitable work, visiting miners' widows and helping to organize the annual Harvest Festival. Father Brennan found himself looking forward to these interactions, rationalizing that his interest was purely pastoral, that he was simply concerned for a parishioner who had suffered great loss. He told himself that the quickening of his pulse when she entered a room was merely recognition of her dedication to the church, nothing more. The mining town operated on brutal schedules. Men worked 12-hour shifts deep underground, extracting coal that fueled the industrial expansion sweeping across America. Accidents were common: cave-ins, gas explosions, flooding. Father Brennan performed last rites with grim regularity, comforting grieving families who had lost fathers, sons, and brothers to the insatiable hunger of the mines. This constant proximity to death and suffering should have reinforced his spiritual focus, yet he found his thoughts increasingly turning to Catherine, to her quiet strength, to the way lamplight caught in her eyes during evening prayer services. Catherine, for her part, seemed drawn to the church as a refuge from the harsh realities of Blackstone Hollow. Her uncle's house was crowded and loud, filled with his wife and 4 children who viewed her as an extra burden during already difficult times. The mines were slowing production due to labor unrest brewing throughout the coal fields, and tensions ran high in every household. At St. Catherine's, she found peace, purpose, and in Father Brennan, a kindred spirit who seemed to understand her sense of displacement and loss. The priest began to rationalize extended conversations with Catherine. After she helped arrange flowers for the altar, he would discuss theological concepts with her, impressed by her intelligence and genuine curiosity about matters of faith. When she assisted with teaching catechism to minors' children, he would observe her patience and natural teaching ability, finding excuses to work alongside her. These interactions, always technically appropriate, began to carry an undercurrent of something unspoken, something that both recognized but neither acknowledged. October brought the first frost to the mountains. The mining company announced wage cuts, citing decreased demand for coal, and anger rippled through Blackstone Hollow. Union organizers from the north began appearing in town, holding secret meetings and talking of strikes. Father Brennan found himself caught between his duty to the mining families and the expectations of the company owners who funded the church. He preached about patience and faith, about trusting in God's plan, but he could see the desperation in his parishioners' faces, the worry about how families would survive the coming winter with reduced wages. Catherine proved invaluable during this period of tension. She helped organize food distribution for the most desperate families, worked with Father Brennan to mediate small disputes, and brought a calming presence to the church community. The priest found himself relying on her more and more, justifying this dependence as practical necessity. She became his unofficial assistant, always present, always helpful, and always occupying more space in his thoughts than any parishioner should. It was during a cold evening in late October when Father Brennan first admitted to himself the true nature of his feelings. He was alone in the church, preparing his Sunday sermon by candlelight, when Catherine entered through the side door. She had been visiting a sick child in one of the mining camps and stopped by to return some prayer books. The conversation that followed was unremarkable: discussion of the child's condition, plans for the upcoming All Saints' Day service. But as she turned to leave, their eyes met with an intensity that could no longer be denied or rationalized away. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be said. In that moment, Father Michael Brennan understood with absolute clarity that he had developed feelings for Catherine Walsh that violated every vow he had taken, every principle that had guided his adult life. The realization filled him with immediate guilt and shame, yet also with an undeniable exhilaration that terrified him. He spent that night on his knees in the cold church, praying for strength, for the removal of this temptation, for guidance from God who seemed suddenly distant and silent. Catherine left the church that evening carrying the same knowledge. She had grown to admire Father Brennan deeply, had found in him a goodness and intelligence that seemed rare in this harsh place. Her feelings had developed gradually, almost imperceptibly, until that moment when their eyes met and she understood that what she felt was more than admiration or spiritual connection. The knowledge troubled her, for she had been raised with strict Catholic morals, yet she could not deny the truth of her emotions. November arrived with early snow, unusual for that time of year in West Virginia. The mines continued operating despite the weather, the need for coal overriding all safety concerns. Father Brennan threw himself into his duties with renewed intensity, attempting to drown his forbidden feelings in exhausting work. He took on extra confession hours, extended his visits to the mining camps, spent long hours in prayer. Yet Catherine remained present, always volunteering, always helpful, and always occupying his thoughts despite his desperate attempts at spiritual discipline. The tension in Blackstone Hollow continued to escalate. The union organizers became more bold, openly advocating for strikes. The mining company brought in private security forces, rough men with rifles who patrolled the camps and intimidated workers. Violence seemed inevitable, and Father Brennan found himself increasingly called upon to counsel frightened families and calm heated tempers. Through all of this, Catherine remained his constant support, her presence both a comfort and a torment. It was Catherine's uncle, Thomas Walsh, who unknowingly set the next events in motion. He announced at a Sunday dinner in mid-November that he had arranged a marriage for his niece. The prospective groom was James Garrett, the son of a mining company supervisor, a match that would elevate Catherine's social position and relieve Thomas of the burden of housing and feeding her. James was 28, considered a good catch in mining country. He worked above ground as a clerk, keeping the company's books, which meant clean hands and steady wages. The wedding was set for the third Saturday in December, giving Catherine barely a month to prepare. Catherine received this news with outward acceptance but inner turmoil. She barely knew James Garrett, had spoken to him only a handful of times at church socials. He seemed pleasant enough, but her heart belonged elsewhere, to a man she could never have, whose very vocation made any future between them impossible. She understood that marriage to James offered stability and escape from her uncle's crowded house, yet the prospect filled her with profound sadness rather than joy. Father Brennan learned of the engagement the following Sunday when Thomas Walsh approached him after Mass to arrange the wedding ceremony. The priest maintained his composure, offering congratulations and discussing dates and requirements for the ceremony with professional detachment. Inside, he felt something breaking, a wall of denial finally crumbling to reveal the full depth of his feelings for Catherine. The knowledge that he would be the one to marry her to another man struck him as a particularly cruel irony, perhaps divine punishment for his forbidden emotions. The preparations for the wedding began immediately. Catherine threw herself into the tasks expected of a bride, sewing her dress, preparing her trousseau, learning to manage a household from James's mother. She went through these motions mechanically, playing the role assigned to her while her true feelings remained hidden. She continued her work at the church, though her interactions with Father Brennan became strained, weighted with everything unspoken between them. Father Brennan watched these preparations with growing anguish. His prayers became desperate pleas for strength, for acceptance of God's will, for the removal of feelings he knew to be sinful. He considered requesting a transfer to another parish, but such a request would require explanation, and he could not bear to admit his weakness to his superiors. He was trapped in a situation entirely of his own making, forced to preside over the union of the woman he loved to another man. December arrived with bitter cold. The mountains were blanketed in snow, and the mine operations slowed to dangerous levels. The promised strike was coming, everyone knew it, felt it in the tension that electrified every conversation. The mining company doubled their security presence, and rumors circulated of weapons being stockpiled by both sides. Blackstone Hollow felt like a powder keg awaiting a spark, and Father Brennan found himself trying to maintain peace while his own inner world collapsed. Catherine's wedding date approached with inexorable certainty. The church was decorated for the ceremony, white ribbons and winter evergreens transforming the simple building into a space for celebration. Father Brennan went through the practical preparations, meeting with James and Catherine to discuss the sacrament of marriage, explaining the vows they would take, all while maintaining a mask of priestly professionalism that required every ounce of his self-control. It was 2 days before the wedding when Catherine came to the church alone. She asked Father Brennan to hear her confession. They entered the confessional, separated by the traditional screen, and in that sacred space, Catherine spoke with devastating honesty. She confessed that her heart was not in this marriage, that she harbored feelings for another man, feelings she knew to be wrong but could not suppress. She did not name the object of her affection, but both knew the truth hanging unspoken in the air between them. She asked for forgiveness, for strength to do her duty, for the ability to become a faithful wife despite her true emotions. Father Brennan listened with a heart that felt physically crushed. He offered the prescribed words of absolution, counseled her about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of commitment, spoke about the grace of the sacrament to transform and sanctify even the most reluctant unions. He gave her penance and blessing, maintaining his role as priest even as the man within him silently screamed in agony. When Catherine emerged from the confessional, her eyes were red from crying, but her expression showed resignation to her fate. That night, alone in his rectory, Father Michael Brennan faced the darkest moment of his spiritual life. He had devoted himself to God, sacrificed the possibility of family and romantic love and service to something higher, yet now found himself utterly lost. His prayers felt hollow, his faith shaken to its foundations. He looked at himself in the small mirror above his wash basin and saw a man he no longer recognized, a priest whose vows meant nothing against the power of human emotion. The night before the wedding, Blackstone Hollow received news that would change everything. The union had called a general strike, effective immediately. All miners were to cease work, and picket lines were to be established. The mining company's response was swift and brutal. They announced that any striker would be evicted from company housing within 24 hours, and replacement workers were already being recruited. The town erupted in chaos, families scrambling to decide between starvation wages and homelessness in the dead of winter. Father Brennan spent that night moving between mining camps, trying to counsel frightened families and prevent violence. Catherine's uncle Thomas was among the strike organizers, which put Catherine's own situation in jeopardy. James Garrett, as a company clerk, was expected to work, creating an immediate conflict that would define the new marriage from its first day. The wedding seemed trivial against these larger events, yet it remained scheduled for the following afternoon, a strange island of celebration in a sea of crisis. The morning of Catherine Walsh's wedding dawned gray and bitterly cold. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, covering Blackstone Hollow in deceptive beauty that masked the tension crackling through every street and alleyway. The mine whistle, which usually signaled shift changes, remained silent, the eerie absence that marked this day as fundamentally different from all others. Picket lines had formed at the main mine entrance, miners and their families standing with makeshift signs despite the freezing temperatures, while company security forces watched with hostile attention from behind hastily erected barriers. Father Michael Brennan had not slept. He had spent the dark hours in his church, alternating between prayer and pacing, seeking guidance that never came. As dawn light filtered through the simple stained glass windows, he felt hollowed out, as if some essential part of himself had been excavated as thoroughly as the coal torn from the mountain's depths. He had performed dozens of weddings in his priesthood, each one a joy and celebration, but this ceremony felt like a form of execution, and he was to be both witness and executioner. The wedding was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Despite the chaos of the strike, Catherine's uncle insisted that it proceed as planned. Thomas Walsh argued that James Garrett's position with the company would protect Catherine from the worst consequences of the labor unrest, and the marriage would secure her future regardless of what happened to the rest of the family. The fact that James was effectively crossing the picket line by continuing to work for the mining company created a bitter irony that no one could ignore. Father Brennan began his morning with Mass, though only a handful of parishioners attended. Most were too consumed with strike concerns to think of their regular religious obligations. The priest moved through the familiar rituals mechanically, his mind fragmented, his heart heavy with a burden he could share with no one. After Mass, he returned to the rectory to prepare for the wedding, donning his formal vestments with movements that felt weighted, as if the fabric itself had become unbearably heavy. Catherine spent the morning in her uncle's house, surrounded by women who fussed over her wedding preparations with forced cheerfulness. Her dress, sewn from cream-colored fabric purchased with careful savings, fit her well but felt like a costume for a role she was being forced to play. Her aunt pinned up her hair while her young cousins watched with wide eyes, excited by the novelty of a wedding despite the tension gripping the household. Catherine moved through these preparations in a state of numb detachment, her mind elsewhere, her heart already mourning something that had never been but might have existed in a different world. James Garrett arrived at the church early, accompanied by his parents and a small group of company employees who had chosen to work despite the strike. This decision marked them as traitors in the eyes of the striking miners, and their presence at the church created immediate conflict. Several mining families who had planned to attend the wedding refused to enter while company men were present. Others entered but sat in hostile silence. The wedding transformed from celebration to symbol of the town's deepening divisions. By 1:30, St. Catherine's Church held perhaps 50 people, split into clearly defined factions. On the groom's side sat company loyalists, supervisors, clerks, and a few miners who feared destitution more than they valued solidarity. On the bride's side sat the Walsh family and their allies, striking miners who viewed this marriage with mixed feelings, understanding its practical benefits while resenting the alliance with the enemy. The atmosphere was toxic, celebratory elements overwhelmed by political and economic tensions that had nothing to do with the bride and groom themselves. Father Brennan waited at the altar, his face composed but his hands trembling slightly as he held the prayer book. He had positioned the young altar boy, Timothy Kelly, to assist with the ceremony and had reviewed every element of the Catholic marriage rite, preparing himself for an ordeal he dreaded more than any task he had ever undertaken. The winter light filtering through the windows cast long shadows across the wooden pews, and the church felt cold despite the small coal stove burning in the corner. At precisely 2 o'clock, the church door opened. Catherine Walsh entered on her uncle's arm, walking slowly down the center aisle. She had chosen not to wear a veil, a small rebellion that caused some murmuring among the guests. Her dress was simple but elegant, her hair adorned with small white flowers that her young cousins had fashioned from paper. Her face was pale, her expression controlled, but her eyes, when they briefly met Father Brennan's, carried a depth of sadness that pierced him like a physical wound. James Garrett stood waiting at the altar, tall and reasonably handsome in his best suit, smiling with the appropriate mixture of pride and nervousness. He seemed genuinely happy, unaware of or unconcerned by the political tensions filling his wedding or the emotional complexity of his bride's interior world. He represented security, propriety, and a future free from the dangerous uncertainty of mining life. In the calculus of the time and place, he was an excellent match, and he had no reason to suspect that Catherine's heart belonged elsewhere. The ceremony began with the traditional Catholic rituals. Father Brennan's voice, usually strong and clear during services, carried a slight tremor that only those closest to the altar might have noticed. He led the congregation through the opening prayers, asking God's blessing on this union, invoking the sacred nature of matrimony established from the beginning of creation. Each word felt like broken glass in his throat, but he continued, his training and discipline carrying him through motions that had become mechanical. Catherine and James stood before him, their hands clasped as tradition required. Father Brennan looked at their joined hands and felt a wave of anguish so intense he had to pause, pretending to consult his prayer book while he regained composure. He asked the formal questions required by the sacrament, whether they came freely and without reservation, whether they would love and honor each other all the days of their lives. James answered clearly and confidently. Catherine's response, when it came, was barely audible, a whispered yes that seemed torn from some deep place of resignation. The congregation shifted restlessly in the pews. The political divisions had not disappeared during the ceremony. If anything, the enforced stillness allowed tensions to build. On the striking miners' side, men glared at the company employees across the aisle. Someone whispered an insult that carried farther than intended, and answering mutters of anger rippled through the opposing group. Father Brennan noticed the disturbance but continued with the ceremony, hoping that the sacred ritual would maintain enough authority to prevent outbreak of open conflict within the church itself. The exchange of vows came next. James spoke his promises with clear conviction, pledging his life and faithfulness to Catherine. When it was Catherine's turn, she hesitated for a visible moment before speaking. Her voice was steadier than before, but those who knew her well, particularly Father Brennan, could hear the hollowness beneath the words, the performance of duty rather than expression of genuine desire. She promised to love, honor, and obey James Garrett all the days of her life, and with those words, Father Brennan felt something fundamental die within himself. The ring blessing followed. James had purchased a simple gold band, modest but genuine, a significant expense for someone of his economic position. Father Brennan blessed the ring, asking that it be a symbol of abiding faith and unending love. As James slipped the ring onto Catherine's finger, the priest watched her face, saw the barely perceptible trembling of her lips, the moisture gathering in her eyes that she refused to let fall. She was going through with this, honoring the obligations placed upon her, sacrificing her own heart to duty and family expectation. Father Brennan moved toward the ceremony's conclusion, the final prayers that would seal this union before God and the church. His voice had become hoarser, emotions straining against professional control. He spoke about the sanctity of marriage, about the grace of the sacrament to unite two souls in holy bond, about the responsibilities and joys of conjugal life. The words were beautiful, traditional, meaningful, and they felt like betrayals of everything he truly believed, and felt that it was at this moment that the church door burst open with a crash that echoed through the building like a gunshot. Every head turned toward the entrance, where a young miner named Patrick O'Brien stood wild-eyed and breathing heavily, fresh blood visible on his shirt and coat. The congregation rose in alarm, the ceremony forgotten as Patrick shouted that violence had erupted at the mine entrance, that company security had opened fire on pickets, that men were wounded and dying. The church exploded into chaos. Miners rushed toward the door, pushing past Patrick to reach the scene of violence. Women screamed, some in immediate fear for their husbands and sons. James Garrett's father and the other company men tried to leave by the side door to avoid the angry miners. The carefully maintained separation between factions collapsed into shoving and shouted accusations. Father Brennan called for calm, his voice lost in the confusion and panic. Catherine stood frozen at the altar, her wedding interrupted at the very moment it would have been finalized. James grabbed her arm, trying to pull her toward safety, but she resisted, looking instead toward Father Brennan with an expression that combined fear, confusion, and something else, perhaps relief that fate had intervened to prevent the completion of vows she dreaded taking. The priest met her gaze across the chaos of the disrupted ceremony, and in that moment, the fragile walls they had maintained between their true feelings crumbled entirely. Thomas Walsh pushed through the crowd toward his niece, shouting about the strike, about wounded comrades, about the need to get to the mine. James argued with him, insisting that Catherine was now under his protection, that her safety was his responsibility as her husband. Thomas countered that the ceremony was incomplete, that no final blessing had been pronounced, that Catherine remained a Walsh and her duty was to her family. The argument escalated as more people pressed around them, everyone shouting, no one listening. Father Brennan tried to reach Catherine through the mob, his role as priest demanding that he maintain order and ensure her safety. He pushed past panicked parishioners, his vestments caught and torn by the crowd. He could hear more shouts from outside now, the sounds of conflict spreading from the mine to the church. The violence Patrick O'Brien had reported was moving through Blackstone Hollow like wildfire through dry timber, and the church, supposed sanctuary and neutral ground, had become another contested space. Someone threw a punch, and the physical altercation spread. Company men fought with miners, old grudges and fresh anger finding violent expression in the church's narrow aisles. Women pulled children toward corners, seeking protection from the brawling men. The altar candles were knocked over, one catching on decorative ribbons and starting a small fire that added smoke and flames to the chaos. Father Brennan abandoned his attempt to reach Catherine and instead tried to extinguish the fire before it spread. In the confusion, Catherine broke free from both James and her uncle. She ran toward the side door, desperate to escape the violence consuming what should have been her wedding day. Father Brennan saw her fleeing and, without conscious decision, abandoned the fire to follow her. He pushed through the fighting men, his priestly authority useless in this moment of unleashed chaos. His only thought to ensure Catherine's safety amidst the violence. He caught up with her outside the church, where fresh snow was already covering the footprints of those who had fled before them. The sounds of violence echoed from multiple directions, from the mine where the shooting had occurred, from the church where the brawl continued, from other parts of town where opportunistic looting had apparently begun. Blackstone Hollow was consuming itself, the underlying tensions finally erupting into open warfare. Catherine was crying now, her wedding dress already soiled with smoke and coal dust. She looked at Father Brennan with desperate eyes and spoke the words that both had thought but never voiced. She said she loved him, that she had loved him for months, that the thought of marriage to James had been unbearable torture. She said she knew it was wrong, knew it was impossible, but she could not marry another man while carrying these feelings. The words tumbled out frantically, confession and plea combined. Father Michael Brennan stood in the falling snow, his torn vestments billowing in the cold wind, and faced the complete destruction of everything he had built his life upon. He could offer comfort, could speak about duty and faith and the impossibility of their situation. He could maintain his vows, preserve his priesthood, help Catherine return to complete the ceremony despite the chaos. He could choose God, choose the church, choose the principles that had guided his entire adult life. Instead, he told her the truth. He said he loved her too, that he had fought against these feelings for months, that every moment of the past weeks had been agony. He said he did not know what this meant or what they could do, but that he could not deny the truth any longer. In that moment, standing outside his church while violence consumed the town around them, Father Michael Brennan chose Catherine Walsh over his vows to God. They stood facing each other in the snow, the full weight of this admission hanging between them. Neither knew what would come next, what was possible or impossible. The sound of gunfire cracked through the cold air from the direction of the mine, a sharp reminder that larger forces were in motion, that their personal crisis existed within a broader catastrophe consuming Blackstone Hollow. The world was coming apart, and so were they. The violence at the mine entrance had claimed 3 lives by the time Father Brennan and Catherine reached the scene. The company's security forces had indeed fired on the picket line, whether in response to provocation or as premeditated action remained disputed. What was undeniable was the blood staining the snow, the wounded men being carried to whatever shelter could be found, and the rage transforming the striking miners from desperate workers into a vengeful mob. Blackstone Hollow had crossed a threshold from which there could be no peaceful return. Father Brennan's presence was immediately demanded. He was pulled away from Catherine by miners who needed last rites administered to the dying, who required his authority to help negotiate some kind of ceasefire, who wanted him to witness the company's brutality and carry testimony to the outside world. He tried to keep Catherine in sight, but the chaos separated them quickly. She was absorbed by her uncle's family, pulled into the frantic activity of tending to the wounded and organizing the miners' response to the attack. The priest spent the next hours moving between crisis points, performing his clerical duties in a state of emotional numbness. He administered last rites to a young miner named Sean McCarthy, barely 20 years old, who died from a chest wound while his mother wailed in anguish. He tried to negotiate with the head of the mining company's security force, a brutal man named Harlan Sawyer, who showed no remorse for the killings and promised more bloodshed if the miners did not disperse. He bandaged wounds with his own torn vestments, heard hasty confessions from men who expected to die before morning, and tried to maintain some island of spiritual authority in an ocean of hatred and violence. As night fell, the situation deteriorated further. The mining company had telegraphed for state militia to suppress what they characterized as an armed insurrection. The miners, knowing that military intervention would mean complete defeat, armed themselves with hunting rifles and makeshift weapons. The women and children were evacuated from company housing, sent to take shelter with families who owned their own property or to camp in the winter woods. Blackstone Hollow transformed into a war zone, divided between company-controlled territory and areas held by striking miners. Catherine worked alongside other women to care for the wounded, setting up a makeshift hospital in the Union Hall. She moved through tasks with mechanical efficiency, her incomplete wedding dress replaced with practical work clothing, her hair tied back, her hands soon stained with blood from tending gunshot wounds. She did not speak of Father Brennan or their mutual confession in the snow. The immediate crisis demanded all attention, and personal concerns seemed trivial against the larger catastrophe. Father Brennan found himself acting as intermediary between factions, though his authority was rapidly eroding. The company men viewed him as compromised by his sympathy for the miners. The miners respected his courage in facing the security forces but questioned his unwillingness to fully endorse their cause. He was becoming irrelevant to both sides, his role as spiritual leader unable to bridge gaps created by economic exploitation and violent reprisal. It was near midnight when he finally found a moment of respite. He returned to the church, which stood empty and damaged from the earlier brawl. The small fire had been extinguished, but smoke damage marred the walls. Broken pews and scattered hymnals testified to the violence that had erupted during the wedding ceremony. The altar where he had stood just hours ago to join Catherine Walsh to James Garrett now seemed like a relic from some distant, more innocent time. Father Brennan knelt before this damaged altar and tried to pray. The words would not come. He felt severed from God, adrift in a moral wilderness where every principle he had once relied upon no longer seemed relevant or true. He had broken his vows, not in deed but in heart and word, which in Catholic theology carried equal sin. He loved Catherine Walsh with a completeness that left no room for his priestly vocation. He could not serve God while claiming this love, Yet he could no longer deny what existed between them. Catherine entered the church quietly, moving through the shadows until she stood near where Father Brennan knelt. She said nothing at first, simply waiting until he acknowledged her presence. When he finally looked up, his face showed the full depth of his spiritual crisis. She sat beside him, not touching but close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence in the cold church. For a long time, neither spoke, both simply existing in the shared weight of their impossible situation. Catherine broke the silence first. She spoke about the wounded men she had tended, about the desperation in their families' faces, about the fundamental injustice that had driven them to this point of violence. She said that the world was larger than their personal feelings, that people were dying while they indulged in private emotional crisis. She suggested that perhaps their love was itself a kind of sin, a selfish focus on individual desire while others suffered. Her words carried bitterness, not directed at Father Brennan but at circumstance, at the grinding machinery of economic and social forces that made true happiness seem impossible for people like them. Father Brennan listened, recognizing truth in her words but also hearing the resignation in her voice. He understood that Catherine was trying to talk herself out of what she felt, attempting to restore the proper boundaries between them. He should have agreed, should have helped her construct these walls again. Instead, he found himself arguing against her, insisting that their love was not sin but perhaps the only genuine truth in a world constructed of lies. Company lies about fair wages, church lies about submission and acceptance, social lies about proper roles and acceptable desires. They talked through the night, circling the fundamental question that neither could answer. What were they supposed to do? Catherine was technically still unmarried, the ceremony having been interrupted before final blessing, but she remained engaged to James Garrett and bound by family obligation to complete that union. Father Brennan was bound by vows that even his crisis of faith did not fully release him from. Running away together would destroy both their reputations, leave them destitute and shamed. Suppressing their feelings and proceeding with expected paths seemed unbearable but perhaps necessary. Dawn brought no resolution but did bring fresh crisis. Word reached the church that state militia had arrived during the night and were moving to surround the miners' positions. The company was demanding unconditional surrender, return to work at the reduced wages or face arrest and eviction. The miners, blood already shed, were refusing all terms except those that acknowledged their basic humanity and right to fair compensation. Violence at a much larger scale seemed inevitable. Father Brennan and Catherine emerged from the church to find Blackstone Hollow under effective martial law. Armed soldiers patrolled the streets, establishing checkpoints and controlling movement. The Union Hall where the wounded were sheltered was under guard, miners trapped inside with no medical supplies or food being allowed through the military cordon. The priest immediately recognized this as a siege tactic designed to break the strike through starvation and denial of medical care to the wounded. He approached the militia commander, a hard-faced officer named Captain Morrison, and demanded access to the Union Hall to tend to the wounded and dying. Morrison initially refused, citing orders that no one was to be allowed to assist the strikers. Father Brennan invoked his authority as a priest, his moral obligation to minister to all regardless of their political positions, and ultimately his willingness to be arrested rather than abandon the wounded. After tense negotiation, Morrison allowed Father Brennan access, but only him alone. No supplies, no assistance, and certainly not Catherine. Catherine watched Father Brennan walk through the militia lines toward the besieged Union Hall, and in that moment, understood the full truth of his character. He was flawed in his human emotions, capable of forbidden love and doubt, but he was also genuinely committed to serving others, to honoring his vows in the ways that truly mattered. She felt her love for him deepen even as she recognized the impossibility of their situation. A man who would risk death to minister to wounded miners was the same man whose principles would ultimately prevent him from abandoning his priesthood, regardless of personal feelings. Inside the Union Hall, Father Brennan found conditions worse than imagined. Over 30 wounded men crowded into a space meant for half that number, with no fresh water, minimal food, and nothing but torn cloth for bandages. Several men had died during the night, their bodies still present because the militia would not allow anyone to leave even to bury the dead. The air stank of blood, infection, and human waste. Men delirious with fever called out for water that no one could provide. The priest did what he could, which felt utterly inadequate. He administered last rites to those clearly dying. He offered what comfort existed in prayer and presence. He helped the few women who had been trapped inside when the siege began to organize the limited resources available. He watched men die from wounds that proper medical care might have saved, victims of both initial violence and the cruelty of the siege tactics being employed against them. For 2 days, Father Brennan remained in the Union Hall, refusing to leave while men continued to suffer. Catherine, trapped outside the military cordon, worked to organize support for the besieged miners. She helped other women smuggle food and water past the checkpoints, risking arrest. She carried messages between families and their trapped relatives. She discovered a strength and purpose in this crisis that had been absent from her life of proper feminine obligation. James Garrett sought her out on the 2nd day of the siege. He found her at a home where women were baking bread to smuggle to the miners. He approached cautiously, aware that his position with the company made him an enemy to everyone present. He asked Catherine to leave with him, to complete their wedding ceremony and start their life together away from the violence consuming Blackstone Hollow. He was calm and reasonable, painting a picture of comfort and security if she would only honor their engagement and become his wife. Catherine looked at this man she was supposed to marry and felt nothing but weary sympathy. James was not a bad man, just someone trapped by his own economic necessities into serving a system neither of them truly controlled. She told him, with more gentleness than he probably deserved given the circumstances, that she could not marry him. She did not explain her reasons in detail, did not mention Father Brennan, only said that the events of the past days had clarified for her what was important and what was not, and that their marriage would be a betrayal of her true self. James left angry and hurt, but his pride prevented him from arguing further. He returned to the company offices and, whether from genuine hurt or calculated revenge, reported to the mining company executives about Catherine's work smuggling supplies to the strikers. This information was passed to Captain Morrison, who issued orders that Catherine Walsh was to be arrested for aiding insurrectionists. The militia began searching for her systematically. Word of the arrest warrant reached Catherine through a sympathetic miner's wife. She went immediately to the church, seeking sanctuary, finding the building empty and cold. She waited there as darkness fell, uncertain what to do or where to go. When Father Brennan finally emerged from the Union Hall, released by the militia after he had administered final rites to the last of the dying, he found Catherine hiding in the church shadows. Frightened and alone, he sat beside her in the damaged pew where they had first admitted their love days before. He told her about the horrors inside the Union Hall, about men who had died needlessly, about a system of economics and power that ground human beings into disposable resources. He spoke with a clarity born of witnessing suffering, saying that his crisis of faith had resolved not into renewed religious conviction but into understanding that true morality existed in human solidarity, in choosing to stand with the suffering against their oppressors regardless of institutional positions or proper roles. Catherine listened and then shared her own conclusions. She said she could not marry James Garrett, could not return to a life of comfortable propriety while others suffered. She said she loved Father Brennan but recognized that their love, however genuine, could not be realized in the conventional ways. She proposed something that shocked him, that they leave Blackstone Hollow together, not as lovers in the romantic sense but as companions committed to serving others, to working for justice wherever they found injustice, to living a life defined by shared values rather than either his priesthood or her expected role as a wife. Father Brennan felt something shift in his understanding of what was possible. What Catherine described was not abandonment of faith but perhaps a truer expression of it, serving God through service to humanity, loving each other in a way that transcended but did not require physical consummation. He saw a path forward that honored both his genuine feelings and his underlying commitment to something larger than himself. It was unconventional, perhaps even scandalous, but it felt more authentic than any alternative. They spent that night planning their departure from Blackstone Hollow. They would leave before dawn, travel to Charleston where Catherine had connections from her previous life, attempt to build something new from the ruins of what they had been. It was a plan born of desperation and hope combined, a choosing of uncertainty over the intolerable certainties of their current situation. They fell asleep in the church, sitting side by side in the damaged pew, hands clasped but nothing more, two people who loved each other attempting to find a way to honor that love within their limited possibilities. Father Michael Brennan and Catherine Walsh were awakened before dawn by the sound of gunfire. The strike, after days of tense siege, had erupted into full battle. The miners, facing starvation and death from infected wounds, had attempted to break through the militia cordon during the night. The resulting firefight echoed through Blackstone Hollow's streets, punctuated by screams and the breaking of glass as the violence spread beyond the immediate confrontation. Father Brennan immediately moved toward the door, instinct pulling him toward those who would need his services. Catherine grabbed his arm, reminding him of their plan to leave, pointing out that walking into that violence would accomplish nothing but his own death. The priest hesitated, torn between duty and survival, between the familiar pull of his priestly obligations and the new path they had planned. In that moment of indecision, James Garrett appeared at the church entrance, silhouetted against the burning buildings behind him. James was not alone. He had brought 4 company security men with him, armed and hostile. He pointed at Catherine, declaring her under arrest for aiding insurrectionists. He looked at Father Brennan with contempt mixed with satisfaction, clearly understanding that something more than pastoral concern connected the priest to his former fiancée. James announced that the church was being commandeered as a command post for the militia, that Father Brennan was to leave immediately, and that Catherine was to be taken into custody and transported away from Blackstone Hollow for trial. Father Brennan stepped between Catherine and the armed men, asserting his authority as priest, claiming the church as sanctuary that even military forces should respect. James laughed bitterly, noting that Father Brennan seemed quite willing to abandon his priestly duties when it suited him, that sanctuary meant nothing when those claiming it were criminals. The security men raised their weapons, clearly willing to use force if the priest did not move aside. What happened next occurred with terrible speed. One of the security men, nervous and trigger-happy from the ongoing battle outside, interpreted Father Brennan's protective stance as threatening. He fired, the bullet catching the priest in the shoulder, spinning him backward against the altar. Catherine screamed, rushing to his side. The security men, realizing they had shot a priest and fearing consequences, panicked. James Garrett shouted contradicting orders, to secure Catherine, to help the priest, to maintain discipline. In that confused moment, Thomas Walsh and a group of armed miners burst through the church's side door. They had been moving through back streets trying to flank the militia positions when they heard the gunshot. Seeing the wounded priest, seeing Catherine in danger, seeing company men with weapons drawn in the church, they responded with their own violence. Gunfire erupted in the confined space of St. Catherine's, deafening and chaotic. Father Brennan, bleeding from his shoulder wound but not mortally hit, tried to stand, to call for calm, to prevent the church from becoming a battlefield. No one listened. The security men and miners traded shots across the pews. James Garrett dove for cover behind the altar. Catherine knelt beside Father Brennan, trying to stop his bleeding with torn fabric from her dress, her own safety forgotten in concern for him. The brief firefight ended when Thomas Walsh shot one of the security men, causing the others to retreat through the main door. James Garrett attempted to follow them but was blocked by miners who recognized him as the man responsible for Catherine's arrest warrant. Thomas confronted James directly, rage over the day's violence and weeks of exploitation finding focus on this individual representative of the company that had brought such suffering to Blackstone Hollow. What followed should have been simple. James should have been taken prisoner, held for potential exchange or release. Instead, all the accumulated anger, grief, and desperation of the strike found expression in mob violence. The miners, having watched friends die, having seen their families starve, having exhausted all peaceful options, beat James Garrett with systematic brutality. Father Brennan, struggling to his feet despite his wound, tried to intervene, pleading for mercy, invoking Christian principles of forgiveness. Catherine added her voice, begging her uncle to stop. Neither were heard over the sound of blows landing and James's screams. When the beating stopped, James Garrett lay motionless on the church floor, blood pooling around his head, his face unrecognizable. Whether he was dead or merely unconscious was unclear, but no one moved to help him. The miners, suddenly aware of what they had done, stood frozen in the aftermath of their violence. The sound of continuing battle outside filtered through the broken windows, the larger conflict proceeding indifferent to this particular tragedy. Father Brennan staggered to James's side, checking for pulse, for breath, for any sign of life. He found weak heartbeat, shallow breathing. James still lived but was critically injured. The priest looked up at Thomas Walsh and the other miners with an expression that combined horror and heartbreak. He said they had become the very thing they claimed to oppose, that violence had corrupted their cause as surely as it corrupted the company's actions, that souls were being lost in this church not to bullets but to the abandonment of basic humanity. Thomas Walsh, confronted with the consequence of his rage, seemed to deflate. He looked at his hands, stained with James Garrett's blood, and appeared to see them for the first time. He mumbled something about justice, about payback, but the words had no conviction. The other miners began to slip away, back into the battle outside, leaving Thomas, Catherine, Father Brennan, and the broken body of James Garrett in the blood-stained church. Catherine knelt beside James, the man she had almost married, and felt overwhelming guilt. She understood that her rejection of him, her failure to complete the wedding, her connection to Father Brennan, all had contributed to this moment. James had been transformed from ordinary clerk into symbol, into target for violence that was never really about him personally but about larger forces neither of them controlled. She touched his broken face gently, whispering an apology he could not hear. Father Brennan, his own wounds still bleeding, attempted to administer last rites to James, uncertain if the man could hear or understand. His hands trembled as he made the sign of the cross, his voice breaking as he spoke the familiar Latin phrases. He was simultaneously giving last rites and receiving them himself, not dying physically but experiencing the death of his priesthood, the complete dissolution of everything his vocation had once meant to him. Outside, the battle for Blackstone Hollow was reaching its conclusion. The militia, reinforced by more troops arriving via railroad, had broken the miners' resistance. Union leaders were being arrested. Families were being forcibly evicted from company housing. The strike was ending not in negotiated settlement but in complete defeat, in broken bodies and shattered communities. The larger tragedy continued while the smaller tragedy inside St. Catherine's Church played out in blood and silence. Thomas Walsh finally spoke, his voice hollow. He said they needed to leave, that when the militia swept through they would arrest or kill anyone found with weapons. He said Catherine needed to flee, that her association with the wounded priest and the beaten company clerk would mark her for punishment. He offered to create a diversion, to give them time to escape while he remained to face whatever justice or vengeance awaited him. It was perhaps the first fully selfless act he had committed in days of increasingly desperate decisions. Father Brennan refused. He said he would stay with James, would remain to witness what had happened, would testify to the violence on both sides if given opportunity. He said Catherine should go, should save herself, should live the life they had planned. He told her he loved her, that he would always love her, but that his duty was here now, in this destroyed church with this dying man, bearing witness to the human cost of economic exploitation and the moral corruption it produced in everyone it touched. Catherine understood that this was farewell. The man she loved was choosing principle over survival, duty over escape, sacrifice over happiness. She wanted to argue, to insist he come with her, but she recognized the essential truth that Father Brennan was reclaiming his priesthood not as institutional role but as genuine calling. He had broken his vows in heart but was honoring them in deed, choosing to remain with the suffering even when it meant his own destruction. She kissed him once, gently, the only physical intimacy they would ever share. Then she turned and followed her uncle out of the church through the side door, into the smoke-filled streets of Blackstone Hollow's final collapse. Behind her, Father Michael Brennan knelt beside James Garrett's broken body, alone in the ruined church, maintaining his vigil as dawn light filtered through the damaged windows. The militia found him there 2 hours later. James Garrett had died from his injuries shortly before soldiers entered the church. Father Brennan, still bleeding from his own wound, was arrested for harboring insurrectionists and charged as accessory to the murder of James Garrett. The fact that he had tried to prevent the violence, that he had offered aid to the dying man, mattered nothing in the military tribunal that judged him. He was convicted and sentenced to 20 years hard labor, effectively a death sentence for someone with a gunshot wound and weak constitution. Catherine Walsh escaped Blackstone Hollow with her uncle and eventually made her way to Charleston. She lived there for 3 months before learning of Father Brennan's conviction and imprisonment. She immediately began efforts to clear his name, writing letters to church authorities, to state officials, to anyone who might have power to intervene. Her efforts accomplished nothing. The institutional forces that had crushed the strike were not interested in justice or truth, only in maintaining order through fear and punishment. Father Michael Brennan was transferred to a prison work camp in southern West Virginia, where convicts mined coal under conditions even worse than those that had sparked the Blackstone Hollow strike. He lasted 8 months before black lung disease and infection from his poorly healed gunshot wound combined to kill him. He died maintaining his innocence, proclaiming the injustice of the strike's suppression, and speaking Catherine's name in his final moments. A prison chaplain who attended his death wrote to church authorities noting that Father Brennan had died at peace, having reconciled his love for Catherine Walsh with his love for God, understanding finally that the two were not contradictory but aspects of the same fundamental truth. Catherine received word of his death through the prison chaplain's letter, forwarded through her connection to the Charleston diocese. She was 25 years old, unmarried, living in boarding house poverty while working as a seamstress. She had lost her parents, her home, the man she loved, and any possibility of conventional happiness. She took the news with quiet dignity, attended a memorial mass at her local church, and then made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She became an advocate for labor rights, for mine safety, for the families of men imprisoned or killed in labor disputes. She never remarried, never loved again in the romantic sense, but she poured all her passion and intelligence into fighting the systems that had destroyed Blackstone Hollow and killed Father Michael Brennan. She became a voice for the voiceless, a thorn in the side of mining companies and political authorities who preferred that episodes like the Blackstone Hollow strike be forgotten. Catherine Walsh lived to be 73 years old, dying in 1948 after witnessing the rise of powerful mine worker unions and the improvement of conditions she had fought for throughout her life. In her final years, she wrote a memoir about the Blackstone Hollow strike, about Father Michael Brennan, about the human cost of economic exploitation. The memoir was published posthumously and became an important historical document, ensuring that the events of that terrible winter would not be forgotten. The St. Catherine's Church in Blackstone Hollow was never rebuilt. The town itself declined after the strike's suppression, the mine eventually closing when the coal seam played out. By the 1930s, Blackstone Hollow was a ghost town, its buildings collapsing, its streets reclaimed by mountain vegetation. The church site remained, marked by the foundation stones and a few weathered timbers, a memorial to the wedding that never concluded and the violence that consumed everyone it touched. Father Michael Brennan was eventually vindicated by church authorities who reviewed his case in the 1930s. His conviction was posthumously overturned, his name cleared of the charges that had sent him to prison. The church recognized him as a martyr who had died while ministering to the suffering, whose love for Catherine Walsh, however unconventional, had been genuine and had not prevented him from honoring his deeper commitment to serving others. His story became a cautionary tale about the tensions between personal desire and vocational obligation, about the human cost of economic systems that valued profit over people, about the complexity of moral choice in situations where no option is truly good. Catherine and Michael's love story, born in a coal mining town's church and destroyed in that same church's ruin, became a symbol for the larger tragedies of the American labor movement's early struggles. They were individuals caught in forces beyond their control, trying to find authentic happiness in circumstances that denied such possibility, ultimately sacrificing their personal desires for principles they could not abandon despite overwhelming temptation. Their story ended in blood as the title promised, but also in something else, in testimony to the persistence of human dignity even in conditions designed to crush it, in witness to the possibility of love that transcends the merely physical, in proof that some principles are worth dying for even when doing so accomplishes nothing in immediate terms. The ceremony that ended in blood was not just the interrupted wedding of December 1899, but the larger ceremony of industrial capitalism's unchecked power, the ritual sacrifice of working people to profit margins and property rights. Father Michael Brennan and Catherine Walsh were casualties of this larger violence, their personal tragedy inseparable from the collective tragedy of Blackstone Hollow, of West Virginia's coalfields, of an America built on exploitation and maintained through systematic suppression of those who resisted. Their story, preserved in Catherine's memoir and in scattered historical records, stands as reminder that behind every economic statistic, every labor dispute, every strike suppressed or won, were individual human beings with loves, hopes, dreams, and the capacity for sacrifice that shames those who treated them as disposable resources. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.